Good morning, Bitcoin. My name is Thomas Hunt, and this is Proof of Work. Proof of Work is a show about the people behind Bitcoin and how they got here. Today we're joined by Adam Back from Blockstream. How's it going, Adam?
Pretty good. We're at the conference here in Malta, Understanding Bitcoin conference,
Yeah.
on the third day, which is a kind of day where people are helping with configurations that they saw during the main conference on the first 2 days. So I've seen a lot of setups, people setting up the satellite node software, C Lightning, join market software, Wasabi software, hardware wallets. There's many of the, a big turnout from the main conference came to the technical setup workshop too.
And it's really good to have all these people together so they can meet in person and talk about things. I know the guys from Slush Pool and Trezor were excited to meet with Wasabi, and they're different parts of the world, different countries, but you get them in the same room and you can really get something done and figure out what the right features are and what you need to do. So.
Yeah, it's very cool.
All right, well, we're going to start with everyone's favorite and most familiar question. What was your first computer?
So it was a ZX81, which a Sinclair ZX81, which I think was sold as a Timex ZX something in other countries. But basically it's a Z80 A 8-bit microprocessor with 1 kilobyte of base RAM and some ROM, and an optional memory expansion pack to a huge 16 kilobytes. It came with a basic interpreter in the ROM, and actually the Z80 CPU is kind of interesting because it has no multiply instruction. So you could only do addition and subtraction and bitwise ANDs and ORs and things like that. So
you had to add the multiplication into the line of the code? You had to
you have to write your own multiplier, basically.
Yeah.
So I know there was some kind of 3D flight simulator game, and there were some articles in technology magazines at the time that the guy had rewritten his multiply algorithm like dozens of times to try and make it just a little bit faster so that the animation would be smooth enough to be usable.
Yeah. That's an incredible difficulty.
So, the programming of games in that environment was really hand optimized assembly, very close to the limit of what the bare metal could do because the power was so weak, and there's no the persistent storage of this device is like a cassette tape recorder with I think about 3,000 baud. I think it's a variable bitrate actually, because the zeros and ones take a different amount of time on the tape. So how the baud rate would depend on how many zeros versus ones there were in your binary. But anyway, you could store things on the tape, and so save your work and load games from cassette tape.
And so is that how you got started? Were you programming games, or were you just playing the games?
I got interested in programming. I taught myself BASIC from a small manual that came with it, and then I got interested in what else could you do with it? So I guess initially I was interested to reverse engineer games and see if you could bypass limits and implement cheat codes. And so there's I bought the next version of the computer, which is the ZX Spectrum, which had 16 kilobytes base memory and 48 kilobytes expansion memory for a total of 64, and a kind of color screen, but with a funny artifact that you could only have two color choices per block of 8x8 bits, pixels. And so people still managed to make color games that looked reasonable by carefully avoiding putting things with different colors too close together on the screen. And so at some point I implemented a disassembler. I bought a Z80 reference manual for the instruction set and implemented a disassembler in BASIC so that I could more quickly read the code without looking at the reference manual. So there was a time where I knew a bunch of assembly machine code, like the hex for the instructions, because I'd implemented the disassembler. So it's kind of fun, and you were able to do silly things with games, like find the area of the game where the room map was with all the objects, and then clutter the room with a ridiculous number of artifacts and watch it lag when it couldn't render them all fast enough and things like that.
That's interesting. It's a great way to start, and it's a lot of people talk about tinkering with the games or with the computers. People tell me they wrote up code from the back of magazines and they could see how it worked. I remember going into save files and trying to give my character more money or more attributes, things like that. Mm-hmm. And it was initially really easy, and then kind of hard, and then now impossible. But it was a much more accessible computer environment. Like the code was there, the game was there, and you could really see how things worked.
Yeah, I mean, not always by design, but I mean, you could look at the binary and figure out where the maps were in the code and change them or something. So it's kind of fun. I guess some of the games companies got more sophisticated in their DRM attempts, but I think ultimately, much more recently, well, many years after that, I did some other reverse engineering, which was more encryption related. So I got interested in PGP. I knew what RSA was because a fellow student at the university for his master's degree was trying to parallelize RSA encryption. CPUs weren't that fast, and we had in the university lab transputer network, so something with hundreds of cores on separate processor nodes connected by high-speed interconnect. So you had like an unusual computer with, in principle, a lot of power, but individually weak nodes. So you have to sort of make algorithms that mix communication and CPU. So I got interested in PGP and the benefits for user control and rights by being able to use encryption. And so I was able to, there's a software package at the time called Lotus Notes, and it included encryption, but the story was that this encryption software is backdoored. So inside the software, so it would encrypt your messages with, I think it was a 128-bit key, but you knew that 88 of the bits were encrypted to a key that belonged to the NSA. Like the NSA had provided a public RSA key.
Sure.
And so they had preferential ability to decrypt it. So the remaining key strength after they had the ability to decrypt would be 40 bits, which they could brute force quite easily.
Sure.
So it occurred to me, this is quite interesting, that this piece of software had a public key that belonged to the NSA obfuscated and inside the binary. So I resolved to find the public key.
Yeah.
So I got a copy of Soft Ice, which is a reverse engineering tool, and I wasn't particularly experienced with reverse engineering on this architecture and this tool, but I managed to find the decryption key. It was like 3 a.m. by the time I finished, and I had like a green screen monitor and like green and black and a glass tube monitor, and the encryption key was formatted as an X509 certificate, so it had an organization name field and like a division or something. But anyway, the person that implemented this backdoor was obviously a programmer who didn't like fully agree with the idea of backdoors, because the organization was Mini-Truth, like the Ministry of Truth from Orwell, and the common name was Big Brother. And
my goodness!
So I got the so it was like a very surreal moment, because I was kind of half asleep, and it was like fiction becoming fact, and like very strange. So I like saved all of the keys and tried to work out which Indianness the thing was encoded in, and put it on a website. So it's on my webpage somewhere, this key.
Yeah.
But it's another kind of fun, reverse engineering or technical thing. And actually it was, the software package is enormous. So it was quite difficult to, and you're looking at, hundreds of thousands of lines of machine code with no source code, not many labels. And so I tried to explore, try to trigger the software to do the action of encrypting a message, and then like explore the call tree step, and it's taking a really long time. So finally what I've hit on the idea to just let it encrypt and then interrupt it, because the encryption is like quite CPU heavy. And sure enough, I popped up like much deeper in the call stack inside the encryption function. So then I was able to back out until I saw the public key on the stack. And you couldn't find that string by searching the binary, so it was kind of, the programmer's protest Easter egg in there with the Ministry of Truth was, obfuscated in the binary, so you couldn't find it. So that's fun.
Yeah, that's a really amazing start and a great way to use your first computer. So did you continue with computers from then on, or did you drift away, maybe go into other fields for a while? Or?
No, I stuck with computers. So, there was no computer science at A-level. So in the UK, A-levels is like age 16 to 18. At that time, optional secondary education. And there was no computer science available at that level at the time in most A-level courses. So I did, maths and physics and more maths and economics, but the college had a computer lab with some, I guess they were x86 based computers, and they had a Pascal compiler, so I taught myself Pascal in my spare time, and had some fun with that. And then, I was able to apply for university, and there were starting to be computer science courses at that time. So I took computer science undergrad, and then I did a computer science PhD afterwards as well. So that was sort of the obvious choice for me, because I'd spent most of my free time learning about computers and assembly programming and reverse engineering and all kinds of fun things.
Well, and you have the ability to do it as a hobby, so it'd be perfect as a work and something to continue, something that you love to do.
So I mean, actually, my PhD was in distributed systems. So designing algorithms that do coordination or extract efficiency despite network latency. So so I'd actually coincidentally heard about some of Lamport's work, which is the guy that came up with the Byzantine generals problem and different. It's a kind of abstract statement for coordination problems in computer networks. So there was, so during my PhD, where I was, doing work on compilers to make use of these parallel computers in a semi-automated way, I became interested in PGP and encryption, electronic cache, and remailers, and this area, and actually spent probably 2/3 of the time of my PhD sort of doing a side meander into encryption and everything related to that. So I actually, after I graduated, I spent most of my career in applied cryptography, like writing cryptographic libraries, designing and reviewing and breaking other people's cryptographic protocols as a consultant or in startups or bigger companies. So that's a kind of transition from distributed computing and algorithms for that into cryptography and applied cryptography. So one of the interesting things about Bitcoin is it kind of combines both, right? Because you've got the peer-to-peer networking, you've got the consensus algorithms that I was aware of from many years ago, and cryptography, which is what I was interested in mostly.
So it seems you had almost the perfect background to go into Bitcoin and to be in this industry. And so I know you were working on Hashcash and you were on the cryptocurrency mailing list. What was it like when Bitcoin came along?
So I mean, actually, how I even came to create Hashcash was related to privacy technology, because I was running an anonymous remailer, which is a way for people to have privacy when they're sending email. And one of the things that people were interested in was electronic cache to fund the network resources and servers that these kind of privacy services like Tor and anonymous remailers use, so that you get more users and provide better service and use the money to rent more servers, basically, or do more software development. And it wouldn't be possible to, PayPal didn't exist at the time. It was difficult to get a credit card merchant payment account. And even if you could, it would break the privacy.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
What good is sending a private message if they
Right.
trace it right back to your bank
Exactly,
account?
yeah. So therein lies the problem. And so now the other problem was with the remailer. So people were interested in electronic cash, and there was a couple of previous systems. Most well known was David Chaum's system, and he had a company in the Netherlands called DigiCash, and they deployed a demo system that people could use. And actually, people tried to. They said that they would only issue 1 million units, and so people tried to bootstrap a value by selling T-shirts and things. So I participated in that a bit, and probably have on a CD-ROM somewhere some backed up DigiCash coins from that activity, but they went bankrupt, and the double spend database is on a central server. So I presume that that equipment got thrown away as part of bankruptcy. So you couldn't prove whether your coin was spent or not. So the double spent database was gone. So a lot of people drew a lesson from that. Okay, if we really are interested to see an electronic cash system deployed, it has to be distributed. So there were discussions about maybe you could make a peer-to-peer network with broadcast a double spend database. So these ideas were around in probably certainly after 97, maybe even before then. And so the other problem with the remailer was, other than not being able to, these services were funded by volunteers, was that people would spam through it, and it wasn't, commercial spam, like they weren't advertising, low click-through things like Viagra pills or something like that, but they were actually just sending like line noise, big random numbers, and we don't really know why, but they could post it to Usenet, which is a broadcast discussion forum, and use a lot of resources. And I think the people that were spamming were anti-privacy. I wanted to annoy the administrators of Usenet servers so that they would either block or push back against privacy. So I was sort of thinking, well, this is, how do I combat this? And normally you can't. Normally, the way that people were dealing with spam, I mean, they were largely failing, but they would try to deter spam by blocking IP addresses that send a lot of spam or blocking individual email addresses. But you can't do that with Remailer because you don't know who's sending it, and that's part of the design statement, right? So it got me to think, what is the real problem here? So the real problem is it's free. So I thought, well, we had the credit card conversation. Oh, that's not going to work. So, okay, maybe we can create a cost without receiving money, right? So then I was like, well, how can we create a cost? So I was reading about hash collisions. I think Dan Bernstein had recently published something that was being discussed on the mailing list about the cost of making a hash collision with MD5, and one of the previous hash, this is before SHA-1, when SHA-1 was the new contender, and MD5 was having problems. So it got me to thinking that, well, if you could find a full hash collision, it would be phenomenally expensive, probably impossible for 100 years. But if you had it, you could give it to somebody and they could verify it in a fraction of a second. So I was thinking, well, it's a very interesting characteristic, and maybe we can make a variant of it that can take a lot less work but still be instantly verifiable. So I was like, oh, I can make a stamp out of this. Right. So I made some crypto sort of design of using hash functions in this way, and that became Hashcash, a way to make a kind of postage stamp to attach to email or use for other anti-denial of service applications, basically. And that's effectively what Bitcoin uses for proof of work. I mean, these stamps would take, a couple of minutes on a computer at the time. And they would have 20 leading zeros in binary. And Bitcoin has, I think, 72 at the moment. And it's exponential, right? So that's enormously more expensive. And actually, there were people who were curious to benchmark their computers to see how fast they could make these stamps. Or there was even somebody who implemented using OpenCL, so on a GPU, to make Hashcash stamps for amusement, basically. So I had a kind of digital stamp collection. And some of them were like reasonably big, like 48 bits and it took the guy like weeks on like multiple GPUs.
Sure.
And if he used that power to mine Bitcoin in the early days, he would have been sitting on millions of dollars of Bitcoin now.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like this stamp collection wasn't really respendable, but it's kind of related to Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin is like a kind of respendable like electronic stamp or work thing. So they're very interesting. So I mean, as to what people thought about Bitcoin who had, been aware of DigiCash and Hashcash. So I mean, there were definitely people trying to construct a respendable electronic cash using Hashcash mining. So there were like at least 3 attempts. So one was, there were 2 sort of similar designs, one from Nick Szabo called BitGold, another one from Weidai called B-Money, and they were not fully buildable. Like they were sort of design ideas, and some parts of them were not fully automated. So they involved like a market or a set of supernodes in a peer-to-peer network that were making policy decisions. And then another more recent. So those were both in. So Hashcash was in '97. B-Money and BitGold were in '98. And then Halfini made another one called RPAL, Reusable Proof of Work. And his variant was using an IBM crypto card, which is a tamper-resistant computer that can make digital signatures to prove that the code running in it is what it says, as long as they haven't tampered with it. And you get a signed message from the hardware, which is signed by the manufacturer, and you can verify it. And its rules would say that you can send it a Hashcash stamp, and it would exchange it for a Chorm coin. And because you had some reasonable assurance that it was running this code, you would know that it wouldn't hand out Chorm coins unless you provided the work.
Right.
And it would also exchange Chorm coins for fresh, anonymous Chorm coins. So that was cool. So it's kind of similar to DigiCash, except you bought coins with Hashcash instead of with, there was no way to buy them with DigiCash, but DigiCash's eventual plan was to get a partnership with a bank and swap them for fiat currency. So, so the people that were involved in that were, I think, like including myself, were pretty excited to see that Bitcoin had solved the remaining problems. So, the inflation control issue. So one of the things that's preoccupying people is that the coins were, you've got mining equipment, and if it says you can create a coin for this much work, computers get faster, and people would go nuts and like print billions of them, right?
Yeah,
and then the value would collapse because of supply and demand. And so they were thinking it's going to be hyperinflationary. How do we control it? And nobody had a good answer for how to do that. And Bitcoin solves it in hindsight, simple way, which is that it doesn't worry about the kind of stable price as such. It just makes a predictable, fully peer-to-peer verifiable rate of supply, and then the market and supply and demand takes care of the rest. So it's kind of interesting, a different way to look at it. And Bitcoin, was implemented, and so answered all of the technical questions that were kind of just ideas. So Nick Szabo's BitGold, he had a discussion about using a Byzantine generals problem consensus algorithm. So like a lot of the kind of necessary building blocks were thought about, but not figured out, put them together. Yeah. So those people were, this is great, like somebody solved it. But I think a lot of people from an academic background who were familiar with DigiCash and were, thinking about things in terms of security levels would say that with DigiCash, you're using RSA encryption basically, and so you could say, well, it's impossible to double spend a coin unless you can factor this big number, and that would take 100 years or something. So they were kind of annoyed that Bitcoin didn't have this. So Bitcoin does have that kind of cryptographic security for signatures, but in terms of double spending, it doesn't because it's peer-to-peer, and the security margin is kind of 50-50, right? So if the honest players, the honest miners, outnumber dishonest miners, it's secure. So in public key cryptography, there's a huge defensive advantage. The person with the private key can have an enormous amount of security, whereas the attacker is at this phenomenal disadvantage. Whereas in Bitcoin, it's like neck and neck. It's like, there's no amplified advantage.
Yeah.
So that was it seemed like that was a hang-up for people from the cryptographic community. But, it's the only way they would get this kind of security is by making an unstated assumption that, you trust this server. And Bitcoin gets rid of the trusted server and it's distributed. Mm-hmm. And if it's not distributed, the DigiCash was a lesson to the people like Nick Szabo and Wei Dai and myself and others that you can't have a central server. So sometimes there's a disconnect between what academic people do and what applied people do. So they will make an unstated assumption or a real-world unrealistic assumption. Mm-hmm. So I think Bitcoin got looked at as pragmatic solution, but it took the academics a while to come around to realize, this is necessary, and then pile in and try to help optimize it. So you've seen a lot more academic interest in improving Bitcoin-related cryptography after a few years. Yeah,
I know Peter Todd told me after he found it, he was really upset that he didn't think of it. He thought that he had all the pieces were right there, but then Satoshi brought the pieces together. And I could see how people would maybe even be a little jealous or envious, or you have to work through those feelings to get back to the actual code, and actually it does what it says it does. It solves the problem. Like you said, it's pragmatic. It might not be the most elegant solution, but if it works, it works. So.
Yeah, I think that's almost a mistake that is a transferable, usable kind of design pattern, which is people sometimes think, okay, I can't deploy this because it's imperfect. So they get stuck on a drawing board and they will never find the perfect solution. Or maybe the perfect solution doesn't exist. Whereas if you deploy something which works, then you can improve it from there. Yeah. And so, I think there have been a few cases with some Bitcoin-related improvements that have been like that. So, that was what I thought, that, okay, the privacy and fungibility isn't so good, but, I'd spent a lot of years working on cryptographic protocols and trying to, reading and trying to improve on different electronic cache-related privacy technology. So I thought, oh, great, I can try and improve it. So that's where I proposed confidential transactions, was to try and improve Bitcoin's privacy and fungibility.
So after you found Bitcoin and got into it, what led you to start a company or to become more involved in the space?
Well, like everybody, I kind of, I was already in a pretty excited state of mind with the, privacy technology and electronic cash back in late 90s, early 2000s. So, Bitcoin was a kind of return to that level of excitement, or even more, because it was actually deployed and realized, and there were much more people interested and excited at this time. So, I just got so interested in it that I couldn't really work on anything else, really. I had to leave what I was doing. And initially I was thinking, well, maybe I will do what I used to do quite a lot of, which is cryptographic protocol consulting, so I could do that for different Bitcoin startups. Mm-hmm. But then I got kind of more and more actively involved and was discussing technical ideas with a number of Bitcoin protocol experts and developers, including sidechains, and we, collectively we thought that was pretty interesting, and that we should try to, start a company to build that. I think while you could typically maybe implement a protocol or a library to make something end-to-end usable, is quite a big undertaking where you need many different skill sets. You need people with experience programming hardware wallets, like embedded systems, and people with user interface experience on different platforms and smartphone development. So, while, a couple of people with experience like writing Linux server software or library software can build the basics, it won't typically be used in practice unless you fill in all the parts. So that's when we thought, okay, really, we're going to need to do this as a company so we can hire people with diverse skill sets. So we started Blockstream. Yeah.
That's pretty awesome. And what are you guys working on in the future? Is there anything you want to talk about now? I know that the sidechains was recently released. Elements is coming on. Blockstream Green has a new wallet now. I just tried it out this morning. It's a nice and very clean interface. Seems good for new users. Is there anything you're working on in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, we're working on, so you mentioned Elements, which is the open source platform that Liquid is built using. And Liquid is a sidechain that's been operating for a little while now, that's has a number of exchange participants in its federated operation. So we are, the Green Address team is working on adding Liquid support to the Green Address wallet. And so we will release an update that integrates Liquid so that you'll be able to use Bitcoin in it, or you'll be able to use Liquid Bitcoin or other Liquid assets for in the same wallet. And we're generally, increasing the tool set and usability around different use cases around Liquid, and working on improving the Blockstream satellites, bandwidth and ease of use, install, reliability, that kind of thing.
Yeah, we got to carry one of those around recently, and it's much bigger than your traditional television satellite, I'll tell you that. But yeah, it's a pretty amazing thing. You can set up a dish and then get the transactions right from space even, yeah.
Yeah, so actually big thanks for bringing that thing. So we actually tried to get it delivered from the UK manufacturer direct to Malta, but something went wrong with the credit card payments, so it didn't arrive, and we didn't realize until the last minute. So we were very fortunate that you were in Manchester at another conference and agreed for us to have them courier it to your hotel and bring it to Malta as you were going to attend this conference here. So I think without that, we wouldn't have been able to do the live demo. So it all came together. It was kind of, we spent the time from when it arrived until we demoed pretty much flat out setting it up and pointing it and getting the software, have it start syncing the blocks. So it was, but it all came together in the end. So that's cool.
Yeah, it was great. It was pretty amazing when we brought it to the hotel. It was like when the doctors bring a heart in the little refrigerator thing, and they're like, right to the patient. Like, it just wheeled right off, and we're like, well, I guess it's gone now. And then, I'm sure the tech guy started pointing it at the sky, and the other guy was typing in the stuff, and the demo came out great, and it was right down to it, though. It was right on the time.
It was right down to the wire, and we didn't have that much like technical equipment. There are more sophisticated satellite pointing equipment, but basically we had like an analog compass. So it was kind of rough setup experience, but Chris got it working, and we were able to demo it live, and it all worked. So it was great. And I mean, it's an interesting piece of tech because it answers a number of use cases. Global reach is a pretty big one. Now there are Bitcoin transactions and blocks that are reaching almost everywhere on the planet. So you can receive the Bitcoin blockchain with no bandwidth cost, essentially, because it's passive, it's broadcast. You just need about, $100 or €100 worth of equipment. Probably 2/3 of that is reusable. It's just a satellite dish.
Sure.
And you need the software-defined radio component, which is itself pretty inexpensive, and some software. So a lot of the decoding is done in software, so it's digital signal processing. So I mean, there is a last mile story. Like, so once somebody, let's say in Africa or somewhere with expensive or unreliable internet connections, has a full node with the data, they have to configure applications to use it. And so Grubles has a pretty nice demo he put together where he has his full node. He set up Electron personal server. He connected a hardware wallet to Electron personal server. He set up a GoTenor, which is a mesh network node. And Richard Myers from GoTenor actually demoed the GoTenor mesh network here at the conference yesterday. So he put the whole thing together and was able to basically receive transactions, securely create them with a hardware wallet, and broadcast them back to the satellite indirectly. So via GoToNet mesh, a few hops to the internet, onto the Bitcoin network, and then the satellite is connected to the Bitcoin fiber network, which is a kind of expedited way to transport blocks to miners, basically. So to reduce latency, the Bitcoin satellite uplinks are connected to fiber as well. So it's something that anybody can do. If you want to get low latency access to Bitcoin blocks for some reason, you can connect yourself into the fiber network. So he would, after some seconds, he would see his own transaction come back over the satellite. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. He sent Bitcoin without being directly connected to the internet. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's even other than the sort of emerging markets and global reach use case, it's also practically interesting and useful for people in countries with relatively inexpensive, high-speed internet that's reliable, because it's good for privacy and security that you can run a full node without advertising to peers on the Bitcoin network what your IP address is. There are people doing network analysis for risk management, and they tend to, we don't know exactly who is monitoring the Bitcoin network. There may be people with nefarious intent collecting information about which IP addresses originate like larger trading transactions. And so you could be exposing yourself to kind of risk that somebody would figure out, okay, this physical address over here seems to have a lot of Bitcoin in his trading, so let's go stake out his house and wait till he goes out and try and pilfer it for USB keys or hardware. I think, for privacy and security, it's pretty good. Now, you can achieve something similar by using Tor, so running a full node over Tor.
Sure, but then you have to trust Tor, which is, of course, set up by the Navy.
Well, yeah. I mean, it is a bit peer-to-peer, but it's. I think even with Tor, Bitcoin uses enough bandwidth that somebody could look at the envelope of bandwidth you're using and guess that you're using Bitcoin. Yeah. Now, nowadays, Bitcoin uses compact blocks, so it's broadcasting the transactions, and then it sends a kind of summary of which transactions are in the block. So the block is not as much of a bulge. But previous to compact blocks, you could pretty much tell it was Bitcoin because there'd be a big bulge go through. You see like transactions trickling in, and there'd be a big bulge in the connection, and okay, that guy's using Bitcoin. Because there's a block that's just like flowing through the network. And there it goes. So I mean, the satellite would not have that phenomenon because you're receiving the transaction, like the bulk data, in a completely passive way. The satellites that are sending the data are general TV and other industrial use case satellites. So you'd have a dish pointed at it, and somebody looking at your dish wouldn't know if you're watching satellite TV or receiving Bitcoin data. And you could even use a cable splitter and do both. Actually,
nice, multi-use.
So. And then when you come to send a transaction, even if you're using an internet connection, the transaction is very small. So it would easily mix in a Tor connection with sending an email or visiting a web page or something. So it wouldn't really stand out so much in terms of bandwidth use. I guess it also saves you from like bandwidth caps, and if your connection is kind of medium band, Bitcoin could maybe be kind of annoying. It like slows down your frames per second in online gaming.
Sure.
Causes problems with your video stream or something.
You want to get that on a separate network.
Right.
Yeah, it sounds really amazing, and I think it's going to be great for the rest of the world too. We often think about how they're going to use Bitcoin in Africa or South America or somewhere where they might have no connection or not a good connection. And something like this opens up the options to them, and maybe even to kids learning about Bitcoin and hacking Bitcoin and having access to the network, whereas before they could just read about it, and it's just not as good.
Yeah, I mean, I think also there has been in the last few years some debate about Bitcoin has many interesting properties, and different people are interested in it for different reasons, and there's no every reason is legitimate, but if things get congested, people start to argue about that their use case that they like is more important than the other use case, and there's competition for the space basically. So one way of looking at it is, and Trace Mayer said this a few years ago, is, what feature of Bitcoin, if it was lost, if it didn't have this property anymore, would cause you to lose interest, kind of thing. So what's the differentiating property of Bitcoin, or why do you buy Bitcoin? He expressed it in a kind of financial way. Why do you buy or rent Bitcoin or something like that?
Sure.
So basically the idea that I think, if the Bitcoin network was down for maintenance today, which doesn't happen because it's like a
keeps
distributed,
running.
like 99.9999% uptime network, what would you still make the transaction? And if the answer is, I would wait, right? That means you have a requirement for Bitcoin, and you're using Bitcoin in a differentiated way. If you're like, without second thought, I would just go use some other payment, like I go use PayPal, use a credit card, or I use bank transfer, or pay in cash. Well, then you're not really financially or in a delivered value sense benefiting from Bitcoin. It's just, and there's some people who were very enthusiastic in the early days about Bitcoin being cheap. And, it turns out it's hard to keep that, that as a property when it gets very popular, because, if you push it very hard and you turn out all the parameters, it starts to lose other properties, and then you get into this debate. So, I think Lightning is pretty interesting because it gives some actual, unique advantages over on-chain Bitcoin in providing instant final transactions. The main chain Bitcoin is kind of not very final. If you accept a transaction that's not confirmed, there's a fair chance that somebody was trying to, they could double spend you.
Sure.
But the thing with broadcasting Bitcoin transactions everywhere is we still need more layer 2 technology, more work on Lightning. Lightning has been growing extremely fast, double digits per week kind of growth rate in the number of channels and channel capacity. And it is a better experience because it's more instant, but it also has its limits, and people are already working on L2, the ELL2. The kind of 1.5 Lightning with extra features, and so there's no shortage of sort of next step ideas. But I think it's kind of like what we were saying about of deploying a imperfect system and using that for inspiration for how to do the next scaling thing. So I think that by providing Bitcoin data everywhere at low cost, then we can see what ideas that creates and how developers in different countries, aware of their local communities, financial challenges, are able to find creative ways to use it. So, and the other interesting thing about global reach is if you look at the differentiated cases for Bitcoin and you try to enumerate what you think they are, there's certainly, countries emerging market countries with weak or expensive internet connections and infrastructure are often countries with capital controls, hyperinflationary currencies, or corruption in banking. So even if people could get a bank account, they're not sure if they trust the bank, and they have a reason.
Or even controls on the internet, great firewalls, other things that would block your access or make it even impossible to use your local network connection for Bitcoin or for other PGP encryption, other activities that might be seen as the government as not acceptable.
Yeah, so I think it's pretty interesting if you want to sort of maximize the delivery of Bitcoin value globally, to get the reach to people who benefit from, permissionlessness, the ability to be self-sovereign because there's nobody they can trust, right? And maybe they don't have government ID. It wouldn't be advisable to trust some other banks they would be potentially interacting with, or they don't have ID to create a bank account. You typically can't.
Or they're too young even. A lot of young people can't even have bank accounts. So.
Right. So, and the point about, access to internet, so here in Malta, we're pretty close to Egypt,
Yeah.
and there's a few years ago now where people were leaving Egypt, and some of them landed here in Malta, and during that political turmoil, they actually cut off everything. I mean, they cut off the internet connection, they disrupted the mobile phone networks, and people still need to transact, right? It's in a time of crisis, and presumably the Egyptian pounds exchange rate was in disarray as well, right?
Sure.
So, that's a time where you actually need access to internationally stable liquid money, and yet the internet infrastructure is disrupted. Right?
Yeah,
So the ability to continue to transact in that scenario is actually, like, that's a really good case for Bitcoin, actually, right? So, I think it's a way to focus on the differentiated value for Bitcoin. So, I mean, people with unstable fiat currencies have, see more value, more direct value to them in Bitcoin. You see people in Venezuela using Bitcoin for similar reasons.
Sure. And that's why when I saw the Cyprus incident in 2013, I was so excited by Bitcoin, because while I don't think the Cyprus people were using it to avoid the capital controls, and they had a lot of foreign money in their banks and they decided to crack down on it, and maybe it was drug money or whatever, but they also froze all the ATMs. You could only get $100 a day. And the Cyprus people didn't have Bitcoin ATMs or access to it, but I think the idea got out there that it was like, what if they did? They could get their money out for the first time ever. There was an escape hatch from your local government currency fails, but you survive. Mm-hmm. And in Venezuela, we're seeing people can actually mine Bitcoin, they can buy Bitcoin, they can hold it, and then the bolivar is going down, but you still have some kind of a purchasing instrument. You don't just have to go to barter and buying very small liquor bottles and toilet paper and other things you can trade. You could keep some kind of a monetary system even as the entire government system is going down around you. So very exciting.
Yeah, I think the Cyprus case was to do with bank solvency issues. Mm-hmm. So it's euro-denominated country, but they had some major banks run into financial difficulty and basically become insolvent. And to resolve that is difficult within the eurozone because there's no, a small country has no ability to sort of print money to get its way out of it.
Yeah,
like
the traditional solution. Yeah,
and I mean that's another cost, right? That's an inflation cost, but they can't even achieve that. So they tried to implement a haircut. So basically, everybody with money in the bank suddenly had some percentage less money in the bank.
Sure.
I think ultimately they didn't do haircuts on deposits below some value because it was politically catastrophic.
Absolutely.
It scared a lot of people about trusting banks in general. Yep. And it got people thinking about whether this could happen in a bigger European country in the future.
Yeah. There's an incredible example and an interesting time to get involved. So.
Yeah, I mean, you can see also the former President Obama made some comment about, I mean, he didn't say the word Bitcoin, but it's clearly what he's talking about with a Swiss bank account in your pocket. And, for somebody living in Cyprus, if you were, a fairly wealthy individual, you could establish offshore banking. You could establish a bank account in Switzerland or Austria or Liechtenstein or somewhere else, and your euro deposits would be protected in that environment, but, from the haircut. But the minimum cost to do something like that, you probably need like €1 million of investable assets.
Yeah.
So Bitcoin really is like lowering the barrier to international financial protection, so you can do it with €1,000 or something. So it makes it much more accessible. So that's a pretty cool use case for kind of wealth protection and asset protection for individuals, and lowering the cost to entry for that to just set up a smartphone wallet and buy some Bitcoin.
Yeah, I remember when he said it, it was more like an advertisement for Bitcoin than anything else. Because I was like, that's kind of exactly what I want, actually, Mr. President. It sounds pretty good.
Yeah, I don't think he meant it as a compliment. But
I think so, yeah.
It was great, though. I mean, that's exactly, he had a nice way to summarize the value proposition, actually.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for the interview, and thank you for sharing with us. It was great.
Great.